be able to understand the Bible better, there's all kinds of different techniques that you can do for greater understanding. But today I want to share with you one of my favorite techniques. It's super simple and it doesn't require any tools at all. Hi, my name is Nancy and this is His Ancient Ways. If you're new here, welcome. If you're not new here, welcome back. So there's a big difference between just reading the Bible and understanding the Bible. And what we're going to talk about today is how to understand the Bible in a greater way, and it's super simple. Now, this is going to be a good video for you if you're brand new to reading the Bible or studying the Bible, or even if you're just coming back to it after kind of a long time away from the Bible. But before I get started, I just want to share some huge news with you. I am planning a launch of a private membership group, kind of like Patreon, but not on Patreon. You can find the link down in the description and also down in the comments for pre-registration. If you pre-register, then you get all kinds of benefits. So let's get into this. The most common way to study the Bible is by way of inductive study. And that's just a process of observation and interpretation and application. And observation is super important because you can't interpret without observation and you can't apply without interpretation. And there's all kinds of different methodologies of observation because that's what we're going to be talking about. There's all kinds of tools. You can use word studies, you can use study Bibles and commentaries, but nothing beats just good old-fashioned observation skills. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So with this technique, basically what you're going to do is you're going to start observing on a greater level, connecting words and phrases. Now this is super simple and it kind of seems like a no-brainer, but trust me, if you're not kind of if it's not on your radar to look for it, oftentimes you'll just gloss right over it. I know that I have literally looked for, in one of my commentaries for the meaning of a passage, only for it to be right there by way of a connecting word or phrase, and I didn't even notice it. So a connecting word and phrase can also be called a transitional word, or I'm looking at some notes, or a linking word, or even a hinging word. And I kind of like the idea of it being a hinge word, because basically what it's doing is it's hinging two verses, two passages, or even, two chapters together. Now, one of the most famous hinge words or connecting words is the word therefore. If you've watched any of my videos, you've heard me say this all kinds of times. Pastors like to say it a lot. If you see the word therefore, look to see what it's there for. And therefore is all throughout the Bible. And it's really easy to just kind of gloss over it, especially if the sentence doesn't start with therefore, but therefore it's kind of like embedded in the first sentence, maybe a few words into the first sentence. It's really easy to just gloss right over it. Now, the most famous therefore probably in the Bible starts out at Romans 12, and it's really interesting because you wouldn't necessarily know this unless you read a commentary, but a lot of scholars think that that word therefore at the beginning of chapter 12 in Romans is actually the division of Romans, whereas 1 through 11 was theology, and then 12 all the way through the end. I can't remember how many chapters are in Romans, but all the way to the end, then that's application. And so the therefore actually hinges the first half of Romans with the second half of Romans. You wouldn't necessarily know that unless you read it, from a scholar or in a study Bible or whatnot. So I'm actually going to give some simple examples today, just one example per category, and we're going to go over 5 different categories. This is definitely not an exhaustive list, but it'll give you an idea of some of the things to look for. And like I said, this is super simple. This is basic understanding of reading, like when you read, but if you're not aware of it, it's really easy to gloss over it. So let's get into it. So the first one is a conclusion with an imperative. So an imperative is just something that requires action, and a conclusion basically sums something up. So this would be words like therefore, for this reason, so then. So it brings a conclusion with an imperative. And the passage that we're going to go over today is in Colossians 3, 1 through 5. But starting in verse 5, Therefore, put to death your members which are on earth: fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. So the word therefore, we need to look what it's there for, right? If you go to verses 1 through 5, or 1 through 4, actually, let's just zoom in on verse 4. When Christ, who is our life, appears, then you will appear with him in glory. Therefore, put to death your members. So it's basically saying if you want to appear with Christ in glory, you have to put to death all of these earthly desires. And then verses 6 and 7 and 8, they actually go into what some of those earthly things are that you need to put to death. So this is a really good example of the word therefore. If we want to appear with glory, like how do we do that? It tells you right there. The next one are terms of explanation. And as it says, basically what these do is they kind of bring an explanation. And so words like this would be for, because, since. Now the word for is used in a different ways, but if you can exchange for with the word because, then you know that that version of for, that usage of for, is one of the connecting words and that it's bringing an explanation. So the passage that I want to talk about today is 1 Peter 2, verses 20 and 21, and I'm starting in the latter part of verse 20. But when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God. Now, why do we have to suffer when we're doing good? Well, verse 21 starts out with for. For to this you are called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow in his steps. So we actually have two of them right here. We have because Christ, but that word for, that actually you could interchange that with because. So let's read this again. But when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God. Because to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us. So you see, it actually brings an explanation to some of those questions that you might have. The next category are terms of purpose or results. So these would be words like so that, so, in order that, and these actually give a reason why or a purpose or a result that is going to happen. So the passage that I want to cover today for this is Exodus 14:17. And for a little context, this is when God was bringing the Israelites through the Red Sea and he had the Egyptians follow. So it starts in verse 17, and I will indeed harden the hearts of the Egyptians, and they shall follow them. So I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over all his army, his chariots, and his horsemen. And I think the ESV actually uses the word glory instead of honor. But the word so is actually the purpose. Why is God hardening their hearts? So he can get the glory, he can get the honor. And actually, if you go and you read Psalm, I think it's 78, it's all about that. Like everything that God did throughout the whole entire Exodus, he did that. He hardened their hearts so that he would get the glory. Now, the next category are contrasting terms. So these are words like but, however, in spite of, instead of. So these actually bring a contrast, and contrasts are important because it actually brings a little bit more clarity to what you're reading. So the passage that we're going to go over today is in Galatians 19 through 22, but we're going to start in 22 because that starts with the word but. So Galatians 5:22. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law. That's a really famous verse, and oftentimes we'll memorize just that verse. But it starts with the word but. So there's a reason for that. If you go up to verse 19, starting in 19, that's what you're going to get the contrast of. Now, the works of the flesh are evident, which are adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness, and it goes on and on. And then in verse 22, it says, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace. So in order to gain greater understanding of what the fruit of the Spirit is, it contrasts it with what the works of the flesh are. So it's a really good way to bring greater meaning to a passage if you can see those contrasts. So the next category are comparison terms. So kind of opposite of the last one. So words like this would be as, likewise, in the same way, just as. So these words are going to bring some kind of similarity between different things. And that similarity is going to help you understand it just a little bit better. So the passage I'm going over today is actually in the ESV. Those previous verses were all from the New King James. But this is from Ephesians 5:28. It starts out, in the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. In the same way. Well, in what way? Whenever you see that, in the same way, well, in what way? You're going to have to go look for that answer. And if you go back a few verses to verse 25, you'll see, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Now that word as, that's a comparison as well. As Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. And it has a few more instructions there. And then it says, in the same way, husbands should love their wives. And so this is comparing how husbands are supposed to treat their wife with how Jesus treats his church. So these comparisons, they give more context and more understanding to the passage. Now, one last thing, I do want to mention that you can use these observation skills even when you're just reading. But if you're studying, they're very, very helpful. And if you are studying, it is a little bit better if you're using a word-for-word translation. I've got a video on that if you want to know the difference between a word-for-word and some of the other translations. It's on the end screen and linked down below. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.